Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Hi, this is Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition and co-host of the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. Our podcast founder and my co-host, David Helvarg, aside from being executive director of the ocean group Blue Frontier, is a longtime freelance journalist and book author. David's first investigative book, The War Against the Greens, came out in 1994 to widespread critical acclaim. Recently, Chris Clarke, host of the desert podcast, 90 Miles from Needles, interviewed David about the environmental rollback under President Donald Trump and how what David wrote 30 years ago might provide lessons on today's attacks on the environment and democracy. So with thanks to Chris Clarke, here's our version of that conversation edited down by our own Rising Tide Ocean podcast producer, Holden Hardcastle.
Think the deserts are barren wastelands? Think again. It's time for 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to this episode of 90 Miles from Needles, the Desert Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Clarke, and today we're going to be talking about something a bit more general that nonetheless definitely applies to the desert and to people working on issues in the desert, ranging from environmental protection to social justice to border issues, the whole gamut of desert activism. It's just that what we're talking about applies to a lot of other places as well. And in the process, we give me an excuse to catch up with somebody I've known for 30 years, so I haven't talked to him nearly enough for the last 15 of those years. David Helvarg, who is an ocean activist. He is host of the marine protection podcast Rising Tide, which is on my short list of podcasts I listen to, and author of many books, including The War Against the Greens, subtitled The Wise Use Movement, The New Right, and Anti-Environmental Violence, which is 31 years old this year. David, welcome to 90 Miles from Needles. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. Just full disclosure, David and I have known each other for almost as long as The War Against the Greens has been out. He was a contributor to Terrain, which was the newsletter that the Ecology Center in Berkeley put out, which I edited way, way back in the day during the Clinton administration. And it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure just to talk to you again, Chris. It's been too long. You wandered off like a sagebrush.
Yep, tumbleweed.
Tumbleweed.
I think I'm technically invasive, but
as are most humans.
Yep. The political climate has definitely evolved to the point where your book seems pretty prescient. It's almost nostalgic to read about a wise use movement that was merely extremely well-funded and nibbling away at the margins of our body politic. And now that the heirs of the wise use movement are apparently in control of all three branches of government, I figured it was time to take a look at the situation and see what you thought about how things have changed and what environmental activists who have been the targets of opposition ranging from slander and libel to actual violence, what we might be able to do to prepare ourselves for the next few years.
Even when I wrote The War Against Greens in 1994, the Wise Use Agenda that had been written in 88, that was this early example of astroturf, synthetic grassroots funded by Western public lands industries. Most people, most politicians, most Republicans even then saw it as an extremist document. It was calling for drilling and mining on public lands, opening the Tongass forest for logging, abolishing the Endangered Species Act. Even in the 90s, it's considered extreme. But today, of course, that is the Trump administration policy. It was the Bush administration back then. And the reason that Wise Use came together was after the Reagan Revolution, they thought that George Bush Sr. was too much the environmentalist. And so they came together essentially to protect public lands industries, logging, mining, and the beef cattle industry from any regulation, and at the same time to protect their subsidies on public lands. And the East Coast had the equivalent with the property rights movement that had this very radical notion of law called regulatory takings, the idea that any regulation that denied you access to profit on your property was a taking that the government owed you. But of course, any government service that benefited your property, like roads and clean water, that was just a given. Again, the Federalist Society pushed these legal briefs, and eventually you had a Supreme Court that embraces them 30 years later. In the West, the public lands industries felt after Oklahoma City, they felt like they'd created a Frankenstein monster. All they wanted was a rowdy movement to provide a front for their continued subsidies, like the 1872 Mining Act.
Basically, what David's talking about is the General Mining Act of 1872, which is still the law of the land, though it's been tweaked around the edges a couple of times. The General Mining Act of 1872 basically says if you find minerals on public lands in the U.S., you can file claims on federal lands that are open to mineral entry, and you can extract those minerals with a few minor restrictions and pay nothing to the U.S. federal government, the U.S. Treasury, the American taxpayers. The Mineral Policy Center estimates that mining companies extract 2 to 3 billion in minerals from public lands every year in the U.S., but there are no royalties required. It's one of those laws that needs to be at least completely gutted and rewritten, if not abolished altogether, and the chances of that happening in the next couple of years are extremely minute.
I wrote about Nevada, where a Forest Service ranger who was kicking cattle off public lands and allowing forage to regrow for wildlife had both his office and his home pipe bombed. And at a certain point where I saw the wise use movement integrating with the militias, I wrote a letter to the Clinton Justice Department saying people are going to get killed here. And it was pretty much ignored until Oklahoma City happened. 268 Americans killed at the federal building in Oklahoma City by Tim McVeigh, who was very much aligned with the militias. His family was aligned with the property rights movement, working actively. And a lot of these people who had joined the 90s militias, a lot of the wise users scared their industrial backers. And so the Mining Association, the American Farm Bureau, the Cattlemen's Association withdrew their support, and wise use as a movement like the sagebrush movement before it fell apart in the West, but the ideology, the basically scapegoating of environmentalists, never went away. In fact, it expanded. At the end of the book, I'd written that if the oil industry, the largest industrial combine in human history till that time, were to adapt the rhetoric, tactics, and violence of the wise use movement, that the future could be very stark. And we're now living in that stark future.
Yeah, it seems like there's a straight line to be drawn from the warnings at the end of the most recent edition of the book, which was in Bush 2, wasn't it?
Right. My one failing was the subtitle should have included wise use in the White House, because that was the title of the last chapter. And that was the beginning where a lot of wise use veterans like Gail Norton from the Mountain States Legal Foundation became the Secretary of Interior. And a lot of veterans of that movement found ways to move into government via the Heritage Foundation and others. And of course, in the late 70s, the Heritage Foundation went from right-wing fringe think tank to policymaker under the Reagan administration, and they evolved with the Republican right. And as it got further right, as it became the MAGA movement, the Heritage Foundation then gave us what's now being implemented, Project 2025, which reads like a reprint of the 1988 wise use agenda, only more radical. Back then, there wasn't a robust clean energy industry like today. And today, they not only want to follow through on the wise use agenda of opening up all public lands to mining and drilling, they want to kill off the market competitors, which is offshore and onshore wind and solar. And so you have this attack by this administration on all things that are basically the future of energy. Trump declares an energy emergency, but clearly the emergency in his mind is not only that being the number one producer of oil and gas in the world isn't enough. You have to kill off the competition. You have to go after solar and wind and all other options that might transition us off fossil fuels.
The thing that made me really start wanting an update to the book took place in 2014 when Cliven Bundy decided to round up a whole bunch of militia folks to defend his claimed right to illegally graze his cattle on protected tortoise habitat and national monument land.
That was classic wise use. It was like a rebirth, amplified now by right-wing media and a Republican Party that was increasingly adapting the language of wise use. Even 20 years ago, when I started my ocean policy group, Blue Frontier, there was an ocean caucus that was bipartisan in the House, 6 members, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, moderate environmental Republicans like Saxon of New Jersey, Gilchrist of Maryland. They distributed my Rescue Warriors book, my Coast Guard book, my 50 Ways to Save the Ocean, with a Dear Colleague letter to every member of the House and Senate. Saxon, Gilchrist, and the others, Senator Olympia Snowe from Maine, they were all pretty much purged as the party moved to the right. It somehow decided that the wise use rhetoric against the environment and climate change in particular would be adopted. And it wasn't for ideological reasons so much as that the Republican Party increasingly became adopted by the oil industry.
Yeah.
Back when I wrote The War Against the Greens, the oil industry was giving money out of both pockets to Democrats and Republicans. Increasingly, as climate became an issue, they adapted the wise use playbook. But more importantly, they invested in politicians and this network of right-wing think tanks and policy directions. And of course, the anti-government rhetoric that was also widespread through the Heritage Foundation and all of these networks of right-wing ideologues. A lot of regulation protects our public health and food safety and environment. And those were the targets they took. And we know there's this new existential threat. Today, it's a collapse of biodiversity and specifically fossil fuel-fired climate disruption.
Right.
Exxon knew back in the 70s their scientists were in the lead and recognized that problem. And then their corporate bosses decided the tactic was to cover it up, sow confusion, and buy themselves a political party. And the Republican Party became the voice of big oil. Also, more recently, the voice of erratic celebrity fascism. That's what you get. You spend 30 years putting out racist dog whistles to avoid the fact that most voters aren't going to vote for capital gains tax deductions or support of offshore oil, but they'll vote cultural issues. I mean, back in the days of wise use, it was fishermen in the Gulf not wanting to use turtle excluder devices. Today, it's the head of Fish and Wildlife being an anti-endangered species activist. And so you have this continuity. The environmental backlash started with the boomers who were opposing the creation of public lands. Teddy Roosevelt was taking on Western logging interests who, when he created national forests, they set fire to them. And after the boomers came the Sagebrush Rebellion, which didn't want any federal land. And
just to clarify something here, you mentioned boomers in a context that is, I think, different from how it's usually used on social media.
I'm talking about 1890s boomers. Private interests in the West called themselves because they believed in an industrial boom for the West. And Teddy Roosevelt said, the public lands belong to the people and I'll not be intimidated by arsonists and land thieves. Back when Republicans were actually environmentalists, which was most of that party's histories, but then they were also abolitionists under Lincoln. So they've come a long way from the party of Lincoln and Roosevelt to the party of racist and anti-environmentalists. I just was in D.C. a few days ago. I was talking with Representative Jared Huffman from Northern California. He says, no totalitarian system has ever been very sustainable or supported sustainable policies. He was talking about the decimation, the gutting of NOAA, and particularly because it's the world's leading authority on climate science. Global climate scientists look to NOAA for just consistent, effective data collection. And of course, that's also predictive. The congressionally mandated report every 2 years on how climate change will impact different regional economies in the U.S. The presidency's just killed that, but you have a quisling Congress right now. And so we're seeing this gutting of NOAA, part of Project 2025, the sort of model of how to build an authoritarian state. They also have kept talking about privatizing the weather service because who wouldn't want to pay $40 to find out if there's a tornado headed your way? A lot of these These are just dangerous. People are beginning to face the backlash of realizing that their favorite national park or national seashore doesn't have the resources anymore to maintain or support. Forget the science, just the visitors. In the marine sanctuaries, like Papahanaumokuakea off of Hawaii is like one of the largest marine protected areas in the world. And there's several in the Pacific that act as biological reserves. They're trying to open these areas up for commercial fishing. So it's just chopping away at vital organs. You're not just chopping your nose off to spite your face. You're stabbing yourself in your liver and kidneys.
Yeah, that's a very apt and nonetheless distressing metaphor.
Do you love the salty characters and ocean champions we have on the Rising Tide? So do we, and we're dedicated to bringing inspiring stories and voices that make waves. But here's the catch. We need your support to keep the tide rolling. A tax-deductible donation at bluefront.org will help keep the Rising Tide on the air and online. If you're ready and able to amplify these salty voices for the sea, dive in with a donation, big or small. Visit bluefront.org and join the movement. And now, back to the show.
There's this active suppression of climate data. They want to basically suppress science. Day in and day out, there are a lot of people that are continuing to do good works and good projects despite the clown show in Washington right now. When I wrote The War Against the Greens, I thought, okay, this is an extremist movement, but it's going to reach an endpoint. Unfortunately, it was a tragic endpoint with the Oklahoma City bombing, which was driven by the militias at that time, integrated wise use in the West, anti-abortionists in the Midwest, the old racist Klan members in the Deep South, and came up with anti-government theories that basically justified violence. And we saw this again with the rise of the Proud Boys and the pro-Trump militias that essentially function outside the law. And now that their coup failed in 2021, but came back with an election in 2024 and pardoning all these Proud Boys who were in jail and rioters and insurrectionists gives him a base for the kind of violence that I saw 30 years ago. When I began looking at the violence associated with groups like People for the West, they were beating up people, and then the Adirondack militia, they were firebombing a woman author's home, setting fire to a Greenpeace woman scientist's home, killing the dog and trying to sink the boat of Diane Wilson down there in Texas. Mm-hmm. They were targeting a lot of rural environmental activists, men and women, more single women living alone. And then they got emboldened. They started shooting up, firing arrows and manure in the Adirondacks. A lot of the violence in the West was pretty much because it was against people who were challenging the large interests, the mining industry, the logging industry. That violence was either ignored or even complemented in California during the Redwood summers in the early 90s. The Humboldt County sheriffs were arresting protesters and then in jail taking pepper spray and putting on cotton swabs and rubbing it in the eyes of the arrested. Violence in the West is a long tradition of anti-environmental engagement without serious law enforcement. When I was writing War Against the Greens, it became clear the FBI was more interested in going after what they called eco-terrorists, at the time, Earth First. And whenever they were approached about violence against environmentalists, they said, well, that's a local law enforcement issue. And the perception was violence directed against dissidents was not organized, but organized violence was like today, burning Teslas is organized violence.
That seems a little disorganized to me.
Oh, it's really sad. Somebody who's acting out and commits vandalism could go to jail as a terrorist for 20 years. People who are threatening judges who rule against Trump or doing violence get pardons. Yeah. This is how police state works. This is what authoritarian states look like. I fear that the anti-environmental violence, the anti-gay violence, the anti-student dissidents violence, this will all expand. And I worry that each situation is different, but America has a long history of violence. The war against the Greens was when they couldn't get what they wanted politically, they used vigilante tactics. And I see that increasingly today. I hope that we, the people, will bring the country back to a more balanced and law-based society. And I know that from my own experience covering countries that have transitioned both ways, but particularly countries where the transition's been from dictatorship to democracy, and democracy doesn't guarantee environmental stewardship, but it is a prerequisite. No authoritarian state has ever cared about the health of the air and the water and the biodiversity and the whole web of life that we too are dependent on.
Just to loop back quickly, there seemed to be a period, and maybe this is just anecdotal and luck of the draw kind of thing, but when I was working in Berkeley on terrain, which for those of you who aren't familiar with environmental publications from the Bay Area in the 1990s, was a monthly free newspaper that went out to most of the counties in the Bay Area. I attracted a bunch of militia wise use leaning people at that point, at least half a dozen, who wanted to be my friend and wanted to work with me and wanted me to write articles on what they were doing and claimed to be environmentalists deep down. And one that really sticks in my mind is Mike Matson, who used to show up at the Ecology Center in Berkeley, where I worked out of, at 8:15 in the morning to talk to me on his way to his job. And he's mostly notable for being, I think, the one person that died as a result of the Republic of Texas rebellion a few years after that. The lesson being, if police helicopter is chasing you, don't shoot at it. But it just seemed like there was some thought, at least in the people that knew of me and got in touch with me, that there might be some common ground between their complaints and our complaints. And that doesn't seem to be even a glimmer of a possibility at this point.
I think people do still have a connection with the lands and the waters. And so that's a place we can build from. When I was in Alaska, this guy, Rob, he said he's the hunter for the Native Conservancy up there. And so he's hunting every day to help feed the elders, and other folks are fishing salmon every day. So they have healthy traditional foods for the tribe. He's a white guy. He says he voted for Bernie and actually wrote him in 2016, but he was voting for Trump this time. And he started spouting all this stuff that you get in this disinformation sphere that's been created. And part of it is the decline of mainstream media, largely because of corporate consolidation and hedge fund takeovers and the loss of local newspapers and the degrading of journalism and the growth of this right-wing media sphere that's well-funded. And you look into a lot of it, and the oil industry's there too. So I think there's a lot of people who just got a head full of misinformation. People are not mediating fact from fantasy. And so the reality of it is ABC News, which every night is reporting on extreme weather events without ever mentioning climate change.
Right.
But you can try and suppress the data, claim there's an energy emergency, which requires only oil, gas, and coal. Those are not the energy sources that are coming back any more than whale oil is coming back. And the experience that people have in their daily lives in terms of not just their economics, but the growing number of disasters linked to a change in climate. At some point, we're going to face reality and have to deal with it. The question is how much damage is done in the interim. And the most damage is the loss of democracy, because without democracy, you really can't deal with these other issues of the economy, the environment, or equity. So I think the big fight today is what I was reporting on with the war against the Greens was one set of industries and people willing to go to extremes to defend their subsidies and defend their rights. And that's now expanded to a global battle. Being a journalist, being an environmental activist, they're at a global level, they're very dangerous. You can lose your job, you can lose your life. And I think Trump's bringing that kind of threat home to America, because you now have a president who doesn't understand or care about the Constitution that was set up with an ideology that said all men are created equal. And for 250 years, we've been expanding that to all people are created equal too. We've got this idea of we the people that was radical and revolutionary in 1776, and that has continued for 250 years to expand our recognition of the rights of all humans and the rights of a healthy environment in which humans can thrive. And all that's on the block now. So it's, I think, as I said, we got a power-mad president. We got a quisling Congress. We've got a judiciary that's headed up by some right-wing ideologues. My lawyer friend says you pretty much know how the Supreme Court will vote. You just don't know how they'll rationalize it in terms of the Constitution.
Right.
But, it all comes back to we the people. So we got 2 years to the midterms. We got to be in the streets and in the voting booths. We got to elect progressive people. They don't have to be Democrats. They just have to be sane. And the number one job for environmentalists today, I think, is defending democracy and educating the public on how the public's at risk.
Yeah.
The war against the Greens is succeeding, but I don't think that's sustainable. I think that in the next year or two, you're going to see when they try and gut all these protections that we've put in place, you're going to see some very bad outcomes. And when the next climate intensified hurricane hits and there's no FEMA there to help people out, we the people are going to have to just bring it back in a new way.
Yeah.
We're going to start having to envision what our future is that's going to be more democratic. And also, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic, but I strongly believe in triage. We got to save what we can while we can.
Yeah.
And that starts with taking action. I think just writing The War Against the Greens alerted a lot of people who thought they were alone, who didn't understand why they were under attack. And suddenly it made sense. And I think that we just have to ignore the fire hose, look at what's really being done at a structural level, and then come back and build a new structure stronger than before.
I think people like us are doing some occasionally thankless but pretty important work. David Helvarg, very grateful to you for joining us today. Just very much appreciate your time, and we'll have to have you back on to talk about vaquitas sometime soon.
Great to be back in touch, Chris Clarke.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and leave us a review or share it with your friends and other ocean lovers. Follow us on Instagram and visit bluefront.org for more updates and additional resources. Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and me, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay hopeful and stay salty.
Off in salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky! There you are. Good boy, Sparky.